Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So in this episode, I want to have a discussion about life as a tanker. Life as a 19-kilo armored crew member on an M1A1 main battle tank. Now, I recently had the opportunity to watch a piece of content that was produced on YouTube about what it's like being a tanker, and it was military history, or I don't even recall the site, but or the channel, and I got to tell you, it makes things seem a lot worse than they really are, and there's been multiple productions that, or multiple pieces of content that are out there that really make or gives the appearance that being a tanker is tough and very, very unpleasant. I would say we as armored crew members had it significantly better than infantry. Even infantry that were attached to mechanized units that were in Bradleys, and I never operated, quite honestly, with just a straight leg infantry / motorized infantry. That never occurred. We as tankers that were at one point were declared dragoons. And for a period of time, we were rolling around in Humvees, and had absolutely no idea what we were doing in terms of that mission. But it was another period in time in terms of the U.S. military. It wasn't long after Clinton took over, and there were some pretty serious budgetary cuts where we had to pretend we were tanks. At one point, I remember that. But prior to that, again, definitely not as bad. The one thing that I took from the content that I watched was he alleged that a crew would essentially defecate in the turret of the tank in an MRE bag. I got to tell you, in my years of service, I never once took a crap inside of a tank. I mean, usually you would just dismount and you would just take some toilet paper and go into a wood line someplace and take care of business, right? Number one was just done right off the back deck usually. I mean, that's quite frankly how it was done. Sleeping, yeah, the driver could sleep in the driver's hole up here. You could essentially lay down, and but oftentimes they would just sleep on the front slope, the side of the turret, the back deck. At the back deck, after ops, you would obviously power down, and that's another thing I want to talk about too. You would power down, and that back deck is very warm, and just put your sleeping bag on the back deck and go to sleep. Warm yourself up pretty good. For me, I would say, and this is going to sound kind of crazy, but if I had to compare and contrast what being a tanker was like to something else that other people do, and you're going to laugh at this, you're going to think this is funny, hilarious, but I guarantee you there's a tanker out there that is going to hear me and is going to say, you know what, you are absolutely right about that. And that is boating. Yes, boating. So when I was younger, my family had a 32-foot cabin cruiser, and when we would go out boating with friends and other family, boats would pull up alongside each other, and they would kind of anchor right next to each other, and you would just kind of hang out. and And at times, that is what operating in a tank, obviously not in a combat condition, but, definitely, during gunneries and, certain field problems, it felt like at times we were operating like boaters, right? So why? Why would you act like a boat? Why would you like hop from one tank to another and not want to get on the ground? Like touch your feet on the ground? I'll tell you why. Tankers hate, they despise getting the inside of their tank dirty. I mean, there are some obsessive tank commanders out there. And they want those tanks as spotless as possible. And as you know, if you're operating in a tank in an open field, what do those tracks do? Well, they create mud, they kick up and disturb the ground, and they make the environment incredibly muddy. Outside of operating in some place like in a sandy desert environment, maybe NTC or the Middle East, a little bit different. But for us, in Europe and the continental United States, specifically maybe like the hill country of Texas, or operating in like Kansas, where the 1st Infantry Division is. Yeah, the 1st Infantry Division is actually, as far as I know right now, constructed more like an armored division, right? It says it's an infantry division, but not really. And I'll give you an example here. So here's Fort Hood, Texas. Each of these sections you see here are actually battalions. So these could be anything from tank battalions to mechanized infantry, or there's no longer just mechanized infantry battalions. When we were strictly either tank or mechanized infantry battalions. Now they're composite battalions of 2 companies or 3 companies of tanks, and a company or 2 companies or 3 companies of Bradleys. So a little different. Anyway, so when you're in your tanks, obviously you're disturbing the earth in these training areas, and yes, it does rain in Texas. I mean, we would have monsoon seasons, and everything would become muddy. Kentucky, there was a tank training unit there. Again, lots of mud. So you would essentially pull up alongside of each other, and you would hop tank to tank. And then we would actually have 2 pairs of essentially shoes and boots, right? So at least for me, in our unit that I was in, we were allowed to wear actual slip-on shoes, like running shoes, when we were operating inside the tank. Now, when we got off the tank, we would swap the running shoes for our boots. Now, when we would get on the tank, we would usually you're going to either get on over here or usually climb up over here, but you would kick off the mud on your boots, and you would then sit on the side of the tank, take your boots off, and then put on your regular shoes and store your dirty shoes, if you had them, in the bustle rack back here. Was that always done? No, but it was done. It was done. Especially during gunneries, and we weren't acting like we were in real life combat conditions. To come to think of it, we actually did that in NTC as well. I mean, it was just something that we did. Food, they're talking about like eating MREs and that sort of thing. I got to tell you that based on my experience, we had a full size cooler. I mean, at one point we had 2 coolers that was attached to the back of the turret, and at one point we actually had a hibachi grill that we brung out to the field, and everyone brings a bag of pogey bait, right? If you're in the military and you're an armored crewman, you know all about pogey bait. Okay, pogey bait, pivotal. And the piece of content, they talked about drinking water. Yeah, we drink water, but Usually I would take my canteen and I would fill it full of, essentially it was Kool-Aid, the drink powder that was in the MREs. We'd use that, but we would, in the coolers we'd bring Cokes and Sprite and soft drinks and all kinds of stuff, and we would drink soft drinks out in the field. And there were times where we were sitting there with a hibachi grill drinking a soda out on the field, and that's just the way it was. And then they talked about the heat, right, in the tank. Like, you think, oh man, it's going to be 150 degrees inside the tank for a number of reasons. Not true. Can it get hot in the tank? Yeah, absolutely it can. There's a couple of things that you can do to mitigate that. Now, based on my experience, the tank acted like a basement. Like, you ever go down into your basement in the summer and it's just cooler in the basement? That's kind of the way sometimes the tank felt, right? So overnight things would cool down, and the tank would cool down, and then by the time it was midday wherever you were at, usually inside of the tank was a little bit more cooler than the outside. Just my experience. And then you could also, there was an NBC overpressure system. Now, not an air conditioner, but you could take the NBC hose, and you could take the hose and you could stick it down your shirt, activate the NBC system, and you could cool yourself off a little bit. I mean, it felt good. It was pleasant, especially, if it was super hot, like, 95, 110 degrees or whatever, depending on where you're at. It was pleasant. So you could cool yourself off. Now, I pulled this picture up specifically where you could see these tank tarps, right? So when you're in your battalion motor pool, right? Let's go back over here. And you are essentially, you have your tank in the motor pool when you're not conducting a field problem. So they set in these motor pools, and you go down to the motor pool, you do some pre-maintenance, preventive maintenance inspections and checks and stuff like that, PMCS, and but again, usually you would put these tank tarps over your tank. Now, when you go to the field and you deploy, this tank tarp goes with you, and this tank tarp covers the stuff in the back of the bustle rack back here, right? Now, monsoon season, it starts to rain. We could actually use this tank tarp, and it would create like a tent over the tank and prevent your good old tankers from getting wet. Unlike infantry, tankers do not like getting wet. We tend to melt if we get wet, and we become a little whiny. So we don't like getting wet. So we take our tank tarps. What you do is you put your tarp just like it is here. You elevate your main gun, and you elevate your Maldus, your 50 cal, on the commander station, and you elevate the M240 on the loader station, and it creates like a little tent, and that prevents everyone from, if it's, you're late at night and you're trying to get some sleep, you can sleep under the tank tarp. It's elevated. It's like a tent, and that's that. Yeah, so again, not that bad. Now, the worst is the worst thing any tanker could possibly have to do, and what we fear the most, it's not drones. Not when I was in. It was not, I can tell you absolutely, it was not a drone. We were not worried about the concept of a drone. What we were worried about most was throwing track in mud. And if you have a good driver, usually the driver, when they get into ruts, they can hear the pop, 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 and that third pop, usually you're gonna end up throwing track. And the mud gets up under the in between the sprockets and just creates holy hell. And having to get out in that sort of muddy conditions to fix thrown track is rather unpleasant. And had opportunities to do that in some very ruthless weather in the mountains of Kentucky, very cold and very muddy, very rainy, and just really kind of physical, unpleasant labor, so to speak, that you would have to do if you ended up throwing track. And then obviously replacing track, that was usually done in the motor pool as well. Now, when you come back in from your field problems, these tanks are just, especially if you had a period of time where it rained out and you were operating in muddy conditions, all that mud gets into those tanks. And you do have in the American Army, we have a wash rack that you can take these tanks through, and they'll get a lot of the mud out, but most of the mud that you end up having to actually get out and it won't come out just through the wash rack. You have to take these big fire hoses and you have to crawl up under the tank and you spray your road wheels to get the mud out of that vehicle. And that can be, especially if it's cold out, you're still doing it. So, and then when you get back in, I mean, those tanks have to be ungodly clean. I mean, they're about as clean as they get to be, as clean as when we received a brand new tank. Now, think about that, right? You go out into the field and you're using these things and you're trying your best not to get the tank dirty, especially the inside, right? But they end up getting dirty. And when you get back to the motor pool, I mean, you are quite literally spending 3 days, if not more, up to a week, cleaning these vehicles. And in the U.S. Army, that's kind of what you're doing. But not getting too much into the operational concepts of how we operated and the technology. I mean, all that's open source. But this video, I just wanted to talk about what it felt like, the life of a tanker in terms of being in the field. And again, really, it's not that bad. We as tankers, I don't know, I felt we had a unique personality that was not, maybe it was the unit I was in or the units I was in, but definitely operated differently than what you would see like in an infantry unit. I can remember one time we were in a field problem, and it was rainy and it was cold, and I was inside the tank. We had the heat on, so we were warm and toasty. Again, we were operating just like this, but we had the tank tarp pulled up and elevated, so we weren't getting rained on, right? And I hear this dong, 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 dong on the side of the tank, and I looked over, and it was an infantryman, and he had a bunch of TA-50 and just stuff that he was holding. And I was like, "Hey, what's up, man?" He's like, "Hey, would you mind starting the tank for about 5 minutes?" Well, the reason for that is he wanted to use the engine of the tank back here. These are turbines, so these get very hot. Essentially, a 1,000-degree air is coming out of that back of that tank, and it's blowing out, incredibly hot. And what he wanted to do was dry himself out and dry his uniform and equipment out. He was just soaking wet, and we fired it up and turned it on, and about 4 or 5 of them came to the back of the tank and dried themselves off, and they were just infantrymen, muddy, grubby, and us as tankers, we are looking for ways not to even get on the ground, right? Because we don't want to get our shoes dirty or our boots dirty, and that's just the way it was. We had specialized boots. They were called tanker boots. Maybe some of you heard of those. I can tell you that I had one crew member that actually had a pair of tanker boots. Everyone else just used regular boots and regular issue GI boots, and then a lot of times we just wore tennis shoes when operating inside the tank. Just the way it was. It's what we did, and did some other interesting stuff too. But yeah, I mean, I think we had it much better in terms of comfort than the infantry, and depending on the type of infantry, and it was kind of cool, and but it's a lot of maintenance and a lot of work, and I would say the vast majority of your time is doing maintenance, is fixing stuff and stuff breaking and repairing stuff, and it's like a never-ending issue, right? And some tanks had better thermal imaging sights, better TIS than other tanks. It was kind of interesting. I've talked about that before. The tank that I was on for a while had really crappy resolution, and we never knew why, but it just was like that. But yeah, again, never took a dump in a tank. Never really was in a position where we were like freezing cold because you had a heater. Hot weather, yeah, you could always get out of the heat. I felt we were cooler in the tank than in the open air, so to speak, and we would always try to, at least in Texas or wherever else we were operating, if there was shade, we would try to find shade. We would, quite literally, you were kind of like circling the wagons, right? Like the old cavalry units where the wagons would get circled. Well, the company would essentially do that, would form this big circle, and that's the way we kind of operated. And yeah, definitely not as bad as what was displayed in the pieces of content about life as a tanker inside of as being a crewman on a main battle tank. Definitely not as bad, and I would say that now, in terms of battlefield conditions and threats that exist now, there are many more threats that exist now against tanks than what existed when I was in the military. The drones are the big issue right now. Obviously, there's other systems as well, but those systems weren't around when I was in the military. There was very few things on the battlefield outside of a like a side aspect shot with an anti-tank guided weapon or another tank. I mean, we were pretty confident that as long as we kept front towards enemy, we were usually okay, right? There wasn't really anything that was going to be able to take us out. There wasn't really any top attack systems that we were adversarial, from an adversarial threat that we were worried about. Again, when I was in the military. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to talk about as well, that I think is fairly important. The level of experience that existed on a tank crew. Okay, so you had 4 tank positions. You had a loader, a driver. So those two are usually the junior positions on the tank. And obviously there was a skill set to being a driver, and you also definitely did not want to be claustrophobic as a driver. There were folks that when I operated in the Army could not be drivers. It was just too claustrophobic for them, especially when you were buttoned up, and you had to button up at times, and they just couldn't do it. Then obviously the loader. Now, if you weren't very strong, and you may not be able to load as fast as some folks, so you definitely want, as the tank commander, you have to delegate, and you have to figure out, okay, so who can sling rounds, who can load a round in 4 seconds, right? I mean, ideally 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 up is what you would like, in decent conditions. I believe that you had to load one in, I think it was under 6 seconds. I could be wrong on that. It was a long time ago. And then you have the gunner. Usually you didn't become a gunner until, probably best case scenario, about 2 years of being on a tank. I mean, that's best case scenario. You could become a gunner. More likely than not, I mean, you would become a gunner after about 4 years, if not a little bit longer. Some, who were very good gunners maybe became gunners earlier, 2.5 years. So 2 to 6 years, right, as a gunner. And then the tank commanders, usually your tank commander, boy, you're looking at an easy, most tank commanders were E6s when I was in the military. So you're looking at, I think the average age of a tank commander when I was in the military was closer to between probably 8 and 10 years. So these guys had, like the tank commanders had, the better part of 10 years, a decade on their vehicles, So lots of experience. The gunners, more often than not, were about 4 years, 3 to 6 years on the vehicle. And then obviously the junior members, the loader and the driver could be just right out of OSET, which is essentially one station training, right? You do both your basic training and your combat arms advanced technical training at one site. So when I was in the military, we were getting on tanks about 2 to 3 weeks into basic training. We were actually starting to get early hands-on stuff with our actual tanks. And that one station training for me lasted about 16 weeks. The average length is about 16 weeks, depending on if you get recycled or sent back or can't pass one of what they call the gate tests. And then, you could be delayed by a week or so until you pass those tests. And that's basically it. But I would say that, based on what I know, that I would say that the U.S. Army, actually the U.S. Marine Corps had some fantastic tankers. Fantastic tankers. They got rid of all their tanks. They don't use tanks anymore. But they had some fantastic tankers in the Marine Corps. Marine Corps is a good organization in terms of a combat force. Incredibly high esprit de corps. Very good unit. And then obviously the Brits. The Brits were really good too. And they were much, I would say the Brits were more practical in the sense that, they would do things like, a call for fire was in the tubesy, out the tubesy, and for us it was very process driven. That probably wasn't as realistic in terms of a real world environment versus training. So during a gunnery, everything was called out very specifically. Gunner, sabo, tank identified. Then the tank commander, fire. up for the loader, on the way for the gunner. So, and again, there were different ways you said that for multiple vehicles, and it was graded and tested, and it was all done. But for practicality, I don't know. It just seemed like that was army-wide micromanagement that may not be necessary, and maybe the British are in terms of practical purposes, may have had some better ideas. I don't know, but very professional organization in terms of the British military. The Russians, I mean, what I knew about the Russians, and then we were, I joined right at the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And I've talked about this before, but we, in our barracks in Fort Knox, Kentucky, some of you who had the opportunity to, go to Fort Knox and go through that training, if you remember the murals, the paintings on the barracks wall were like Abrams tanks driving through Moscow, like the Kremlin was burning, and that was painted on the walls. And to this day, I would love to get a picture of that wall that existed in one of those barracks buildings in Fort Knox, Kentucky, just to kind of show what the mindset of the U.S. military at the time. And you as maybe you were a tanker in the Soviet military, did you have Washington D.C. burning and T-72 tanks driving through the capital? I don't know, or maybe some other Western European nation state. I doubt very much. I would say it would probably have been more likely the American army would have got to Moscow before the Soviet army would have got to Washington D.C. Maybe someplace in Western Europe, maybe Paris or something like that. Who knows? But anyway, I would love to get my hands on a picture of those paintings that existed in those barracks, because they were, in this age of political correctness, I don't know. At some point, maybe they painted over them. I don't know. But they were definitely present. Anyway, I've hearkened on long enough, and we'll just end for there. Have a good day, everybody.